Okay, can everybody see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Welcome to Transeo's webinar today about the counselor recommendation. This is a very popular, we have about 50 registrants for it. It's always probably the hardest part of your year, trying to find time to do your kids justice and get this checked off your to-do list in the fall. So thank you very much for attending today. My name is Ann Herbener, and I'm the Education Services Manager at Transeo. All that means is that I'm in charge of everything college related. I have 36 years of experience in education, and the last 20 as a college counselor. I wrote all of our recommendations, so I'd write between 95 and 110 recommendation letters every year. That's not counting all the forms that go along with those. And I have with me today Tara Lebar, one of my colleagues from the Great Plains ACAC, and I'll let her introduce herself.
Yeah, thank you, Ann. I'm excited to be here as well. I am currently the Associate Director for Academic Affairs with the Kansas Board of Regents, which essentially means I get to serve as a post-secondary resource to all of the counselors in Kansas, and I work with that post-secondary transition piece from the higher ed perspective for the state of Kansas, which is a really exciting role. I took that position in August of 2020, but before I did that, I worked for 17 years as a public high school counselor, and basically I have 23 years of experience in K-12 education. So the bulk of my profession has been in K-12 education. And as a public high school counselor, I did all of it. I did all of the comprehensive counseling. So I wrote recommendation letters, did post-secondary transition, but I also did social emotional counseling and academic advising and everything that walked in the door. I just had a section of the alphabet and worked with the 9 through 12 and families and whatnot. So it's been a fun transition to move to the higher ed sector, but I also loved working in the high school. And it was actually through some volunteer work with the Great Plains Association for College Admissions Counseling, which is where I met Ann, and we connected and worked together, became colleagues. And so it was fun to be invited to present with her and talk about our experience writing recommendations. So
yeah, both Tara and I are used to large public schools where your letter of recommendation is important, but we were also trying to juggle all the other parts of a large public school. Right. So we're going to talk today about how is it used. We're going to talk about a counselor recommendation questionnaire that can get you more information to write a good picture of your students. A couple different ways to format your recommendation and best practices and some tips maybe for meeting deadlines and also training your teachers with their side of the recommendation. First, what is your role? It's different than the teachers. We want the teachers to write about their interactions with the students. And there are still lots of schools, and I know mine was this way, where the teachers got a resume and wrote about everything the student did. No, I want the English teacher to write about English and the football coach to write about football and not have those things, just their view on the student. So a counselor's view is to create a context of that student within the senior class. Where do they fit in? And you're used to the Common App recommendation where you had to say, how rigorous is this student's course load? Where does the student fit in with academic rigor compared to everybody else? It's also a chance for you to explain any extenuating circumstances of the student, like family issues, financial concerns. I know, especially during COVID, there were some mental health issues and some other things that you have to explain a transcript. Why does their transcript look different for sophomore year? Well, that was the COVID year and they had to work remotely. Supporting the student's application as well. Maybe the student doesn't have the most rigorous courses in your high school, but explain the reasons for that and make the transcript three-dimensional, not just a list of the classes, but give some perspective on he challenged himself taking AP classes, but he got B's and C's because of it. So those things all help create a picture of the student besides just individual classes.
Mhm. Yeah, I always thought like the counselor recommendation kind of went in parallel with the student's essay. And almost supported that application, just kind of went alongside and validated whatever the student was putting in that application. And I love what Anne has typed there too, kind of makes that transcript 3D. It turns that transcript and application into a 3D person. And I think that's the counselor recommendation has the power to be able to do that, which I love.
So with everything else you have to do, how do you get good information about the student and personal information, especially, I had 1,800 students. My first year, we had 2,400 before we split with the other high school. And even if you're assigned to that student for 4 years, or you're the college counselor and you just focus on that, it's hard to get good information. So what I did was I put together questions for my student, and you can use your platform, whatever, if you guys have a product that you use as a platform, or you could use it as a Google Doc or put it in Canvas, whatever your school uses for documents, and have them really think about questions that delve into who they are and how they're making this transition into the next steps. Like, how would you describe yourself in 5 words? Or what experience are you most proud of? But also, what experience are you not proud of? When did you struggle and why? How did you overcome adversity? And how does your family affect your college going plans? What part of your story do you want your counselor to help tell colleges? So giving them a little bit of input in that. So you can create an e-form to distribute to seniors. And I required this form before I would write anything. So then what I would do is I would print that form out, take it home on the weekends, and I wrote my letters on Sunday afternoon. We're going to talk a little bit about that when we hit managing deadlines. But this assists you to give students a voice in the recommendation and assist you with information that they might not otherwise have had.
Now, a way I use the recommendation questionnaire, and this is totally optional as well, but I feel like I got a lot out of it, is I used the counselor back to the student questionnaire, Anne. I use the student questionnaire. I did a little interview with my student. So I have them fill out the student questionnaire. And then once it was completed, I brought the student in to talk to me, and we read through the answers together. Now, I didn't have to do that, but at the same time, I got so much out of, first of all, the questionnaire, but it was that face-to-face conversation that I didn't read the questions or the answers in advance, but we would read them together, and I would read the answers, and we would talk a little bit about the answers. And it would just be a dialogue between me and the student prior to writing that recommendation. And they would sometimes fill in more details, or we would, but honestly, by the time they filled out that questionnaire, and then we would have that very, very informal, I say interview almost in quotation marks, because it wasn't an interview. It was really just a conversation about the questionnaire. But by the time we did that, I just got such a great feel for that student as an individual, that it really helped me write a more unique recommendation. And again, like Anne, I always had probably 100 seniors on my caseload around that number. And so even though I had worked with these seniors for 4 years, in most cases, or even new families, a lot of times these seniors, I still didn't know them as well as I would have liked to be able to write that personalized letter just off the top of my head. This counselor recommendation questionnaire really helped me make that recommendation personal in a way that that surprised me. I really felt like it helped me even in our large public school setting. So,
and Terry used a parent recommendation question, which is a great idea. Explain that a little bit, Tara.
Sure. So again, this is totally optional. And for what my process was is I would, and we'll talk about the timeline in this too, but I would ask my students that needed a recommendation. I would ask them to fill out the student recommendation questionnaire, and I would ask them to give their parents the recommendation questionnaire. And the parent questionnaire only had 5 questions on it. You can see the questions right there. And it served a couple purposes. One, we had a lot of parents that were like to be very involved, and I did not want the parents involved in the interview. I did not. So this was a really great way for the parents to be involved in the recommendation process, but not involved in my conversation or in my recommendation. But this gave the parents a place to participate, and they could write as much or as little as they wanted to. And anything they wrote to me was just to me. And I told them they didn't have to write, everything was just, I mean, obviously complete sentences would be nice, but it didn't even have to be, because it was really just to me. And so you can kind of see some of the things you'll see in the 3rd bullet. Your child's high school career has been pleasurable or painful because. Don't hesitate to write about both. Again, this is a place where the parent can talk about maybe some struggles or some challenges that they had in school. And again, I'm not going to share that necessarily. I'm going to use my professional judgment, but there might be something that was a challenge that does give me context. And the cool thing about this was, first of all, in the interview, I would always read these to the students. And a lot of times the students hadn't read the answers. So it was this really great feel-good moment with the student. And the second part is that it often gave me this really great adult perspective on the student that the student was unable to articulate. And so sometimes it just helped me give just a couple little details that filled my recommendation out. And again, you're using your professional judgment. I'm not going to put anything in there that's not appropriate. That's not, I'm not going to add anything that doesn't fit. But sometimes parents have that perspective over the long term. They've seen their child grow, and you're not going to get that from the student's perspective. And so all of a sudden, like, the parent puts a couple pieces together, puzzle pieces together for me, and you look at that and you go, oh my gosh, that does make a lot of sense. Wow. And so it really was a lot of times that parent recommendation questionnaire just gave me a couple really key pieces that made my recommendation even more powerful. So it's a really cool piece. If, again, it's completely optional. If it's not something that your parents would do, it's not a piece. But if it keeps your parents busy, if it's something, it's a really easy thing to put in place that you could do if you feel like it would be appropriate for your community. So
I think that's always good to have parents feel like they're included, and they do need something to do. But it always amazes me how the kids and the students and the parents' perceptions are so different.
mm-hmm.
I had an administrator whose daughter was going through the process. Oh, she'll want to stay at home and go to community college. She said, no, I don't. Just the opposite sides of it. So that's always good to see. So let's talk about the narrative format. And I taught AP English before I was a counselor. So I had juniors, and so I wrote tons of letters before I was a counselor. And I think it's important to tell a story. I love writing recommendations. Now, about number 50, I start to lose my enthusiasm for it. But at first, I'd love to take those questionnaires and look at their resume and their transcript and really figure out who they are and analyze them and tell a story. Every time I write one, then I would go to the students next day. I wish I could show you my recommendation. It's a work of art. Don't just regurgitate their resume by listing activities. Pick 1 or 2 things and tell a story about them. Even if it's just something you heard secondhand from a teacher, or something a parent said, or something you saw in a hallway. Tell a story and try to make that person, that kid, 3D. The interview notes, adding stories are the most important aspects of a student. And I heard this in grad school once. There is not a class that teaches you about college counseling when you become a school counselor. There's no one teaches you how to write a recommendation. But you are trained to evaluate people and read people. And so be confident in your skills that way. If the writing part is a struggle for you, use proofreaders maybe, but be more confident in your counseling skills because you all have that. So I wrote a story about a student. This student transferred to us from a small K-8 Christian academy. His parents were worried that he would get eaten alive. He spent lunches eating by himself, but he took my advice with activities and course choices that gave him a niche. He is now one of our best leaders. So that's just a little blurb story that I included with lots of other things in my narrative recommendation. I have lots of other stories that are probably too personal, FERPA kind of things I didn't want to publish, but that gives you a snippet on what a narrative format would look like. And then Tara has a bullet format.
Right. So several years ago, this is another format that started to come out and become popular with counselors. And before that, I was writing. Before that, I was writing the narrative format. And to be honest with you, this format actually is very similar to the format I was writing in my narrative. In my narrative recommendations, I was doing an introductory paragraph where I would try to kind of grab my reader and say something, about the student. Then I would spend about a paragraph talking about their academic history. Then I would spend a paragraph talking about their outside interests, what they did outside of school. And then I would spend another paragraph or, talking about, my recommendation and pulling it all together. Well, the bullet format really does the same thing. The only difference is it's more like a resume. And so instead of tying everything together and having it a flow in a narrative sample, you can use bulleted items and you use a mix of paragraphs and bulleted items. And I'm going to show you what this looks like in a second, but I'll kind of talk you through it first. And for counselors who are trying to write, especially during the school day, this format, it takes some adjusting to get used to, but it is a little more friendly for the stop and start, which is nice. And I also think when you're writing to, an admissions counselor who's reading a bunch of these, I think it does lend itself to kind of writing things in a skim style, meaning, you're kind of just putting facts out, bulleted items that are easily grabbed by eyeballs. And so anyway, you use kind of category titles, and then you use a mix of paragraphs and bulleted items. So for example, you're going to have a title that looks like distinctive qualities. And that's going to essentially be your introductory paragraph, where you're going to start off and you're going to introduce the student in a similar way you would do with that narrative format. Then your next category is going to be academic history, and you'll have 3 to 5 bullet items that will talk about different things about their academics, but they won't necessarily be tied all together. Okay, then the next category will be activities, interests, and areas of impact. And again, another 3 to 5 bulleted items, but these would be things outside of the school, or their activities in school, or sports, or community, or whatever fits that student. And then your last category, student self-reflection, additional comments, your recommendation, that type of thing. One of the questions we would ask students on our questionnaire was, we would ask them to pick 5 words that described themselves. They would pick 5 adjectives or 4 adjectives. And so I would use those words in that student self-reflection paragraph. And then I would add my own comments about, kind of pulling all of those things together and put that recommendation in that concluding paragraph. And then, so like I said, I would use that distinctive quality and those additional comments to kind of tie everything together. So you can see the sample format there on the right. And then, Anne, if you go to the next slide,
I was going to say this,
Go ahead.
aligns really well with Common App and secondary school reports that you have to do.
Mhm.
The questions are very similar. Also, I just found a typo on there. Sorry, everyone. Whoop, hold on. There we go.
Oh, there we go. So you can kind of see, so I put a sample letter here and you can see how it balances out. Now, I'll be honest, when I moved to this, I don't think the content is actually more than what I was writing in the narrative format, but it got a lot harder to write in one page. So I think it's still one page of content, but keeping it on one page just with the spacing and whatnot got to be more difficult. But you can see, introductory paragraph in distinctive qualities and, academic history. They're just like those bulleted points are like one sentence or 1 to 2 sentences of, comments about those academics. They're still kind of honestly saying the same things I was saying. I'm just not tying those comments together to each other anymore. I'm literally just saying them one at a time but each of them have some type of context to that student. And then I pull it all together at the end, and then you can see it, and I'll put this in the chat too. You can see we have a link, and we'll send that out as well with the recording. There's a link to some other sample bullet recommendations. This was from a NACAC presentation about the bullet format. And so there's counselor recommendations and teacher recommendations in that bullet format. And I'll be honest, it took a minute for me to get used to this format when I moved from the narrative to the bullet format. It was slow for a minute, but I did actually eventually like, being able to kind of use that. And I use it for most students, and some students it didn't fit, and I like the narrative style too. So it's just another way. Again, personal preference, and another way you could do it.
That admission reps would really like this. It would be easier for them to read.
Exactly. Yeah, it's just another. Yeah, and I don't think there's I don't necessarily think there's even a good or a bad way to do it. It's just another option.
And when we send the recording out, I'll send a link or attachments for all the things that we're sharing with you today.
Perfect.
So I know this is on everybody's mind, is how do you manage your workload? I definitely would start the beginning of the year with early admission, early decision kids first. And I think finding the kids who are going to need those, it starts junior year. Either you have a lesson with your juniors, or we did individual interviews during junior year, and we would ask them right away, are you going to apply early action, early decision? Which colleges are you planning to apply to? And so I would start to make a spreadsheet and put those kids on the top. I knew I would have to get theirs done early. The counselor questionnaire, I pushed that out to all the kids. And so anyone who had it done, who was at the top of my list, that's how I worked through them. This is something I don't think counselors do enough of. Block time on your calendar, close the door, and say you're in a meeting. I used to find other places in the building. So otherwise they would just knock on my window and peer at me while I was writing. So find other places like the teacher's lounge or another work area where you can get things done and not be interrupted. That was really hard in my day. So like I said, a lot of times I would just take, in the fall, most years, would take my laptop home, print off all my counselor recs, and on Sunday afternoons, while my husband was watching football, I would write recommendations in the fall. I found during the week, by the time you get home and you have all the other things that go on in the evening for school, it was just hard. Advertise a recommendation request deadline. I started with 2 weeks, and then I got realistic and used 5 business days. But sometimes I would write recommendations and I had no deadline in sight, and just get as many done as I could. But you don't want them asking you the day something is due. And set a recommendation policy too. Make sure you advertise FERPA, that the kids and the parents know they waive their right to access your recommendation. You don't want a kid that doesn't get into an Ivy League school blame you for the recommendation and get your administration to hand over your letter. Make sure you keep them confidential.
Well,
Go ahead.
one thing we did on this advertising recommendation request deadlines, especially for those like junior year teachers that write a lot of recommendations, and we would do this on the counseling door as well. But I made a paper and then laminated it that just said recommendations requested today would be ready by, and then we would use a dry erase marker. And so we could say, you know, requested today would be ready by November 15th, or would be ready by, and we could put, you know, because for example, like your junior year English teachers, they get slammed. And so maybe they have 15 all of a sudden, and so or 20, and they are loaded up. So they can put that on their door to kind of say, all right, yeah, I know it's mid-September, but now I'm writing for December 1st at this point, you know. And then I would try, it's just a visual reminder to kind of let students know, all right, I'm working about 2 weeks out right now on recommendations. Or if they're working even further, because I know sometimes our teachers would get so slammed that they would have to work further than that. But we would try to put that 2-week reminder on students as well, because it's just another visual reminder for those students to ask for those recommendations in a timely manner.
Well, that's a really good idea. And I'll talk more about it with teacher training. But I tell for counselor recommendations, I can't set a limit. That I have to write all of them that they request. But I don't have to do it 2 days before a deadline. Teachers, on the other hand, I told them, if you feel like you can only do 20 recommendations well, then when number 21 asks you, say no. Say, I've reached my quota. I can only write 20, and make sure you send emails out and advertise. You can send emails out and put everything in print, and you still won't have kids and parents read it. So I'm a big advocate of a counselor being your own marketer, and use social media and every kind of communication you can think of. Then when I'm writing my letters, I had a saved template that was basically, I put names in the date in the top and the bottom, but my middle paragraph was completely different for every student. And that way it just saved a lot of time. And then I had an electronic signature. I had a JPEG of my signature that I inserted to all those letters, so it was ready to upload. Big reach out to your support staff for help. Now, I have a couple of Cleveland high school counselors on this webinar today. They don't have a secretary working with them. Can you believe it, Tara?
Oh my gosh.
I know. But the support staff can help organize that for you, help you upload it to kids' applications or scholarship applications. And that saves a lot of time that way too. Anything else on managing your workload, Tara?
Well, the other thing that I would try to do too, and this is maybe my own sanity, but I would write and then I would always try to sleep on it and then proofread the next day. I always tried to give myself just a little bit of a break, and not always, but almost always that was my process. And give it a once over for sure the next day before I uploaded it and sent it, just so that I didn't miss anything. And again, everyone finds their own system, but that was always my system. Is if I would spend a whole bunch of time writing, then I would at least try to, give it one more day before I had to send it in.
And I would let my secretary know, I have these letters done. They're ready to be sent with their secondary school reports or in transcripts. So we were constantly back and forth. If there was a student who was applying somewhere and my letter wasn't done, she would come over and say, hey, Sally came down and wants to send her recommendations, but she needs your part. So we were always managing that back and forth.
Yeah. Well, and so this is the really fun part, right? The professional judgment part. That first of all, it's always tricky and important to explain the FERPA rights and that FERPA form to your students, the Family Educational Rights Protection Act, where you want to explain to your students why they need to fill that out, and obviously what their choices are in filling that out. So whether you have Transeo or Naviance or Zello or wherever, or just explaining that through the Common App, students have to make that choice in whether they want to waive their rights to see their application documents after the admissions process is over or not. So when I would explain that to my students, I would explain, this is the form. We would look at it. I would show them the process. And then I would say, these are the choices. And then I would say, this is, you are, if you waive your right, that means you are not going to see your recommendations from your teachers or from your counselors, anything that's sent on your behalf. If you waive your right, you will not see anything. After that, you won't have that choice. If you do not waive your right, you have the option to see that. It is your choice to make. But then I would tell them, in choosing to waive your right, in general, that tells the school that that you trust the decision of your teachers, and that you are essentially making sure that those recommendations are confidential. And and then if you say no, then that's the other thing that you're saying. Now, this is the decision you get to make. And I can't tell you what's right or wrong. And of course, you want them to have the choice because it is their right to give. But I want to be, it's one of those tricky, it's almost like voting now, where they make it as confusing as possible. You got to try to explain the choices and what each side means, because it's a yes is no and no is yes kind of moment. But at the same time, trying to say most students do waive their right in this instance. And by waiving your right, you're showing that you trust your educational professionals to say something nice about you. And in general, no one's going to write a recommendation that isn't positive about you. At least that was our practice at my school. And so, I tried to explain that without telling them what to do, and without without taking away any of their choices in the matter. And so that's always an interesting dance. And then
our district policy was that they had to waive their right to their recommendations. So we did not give them a choice, but that was a district policy after lots of committee meetings and talking to admission reps and all that kind of thing, that they had to check FERPA saying, but FERPA also protects them, that we don't send their transcripts without their request.
Mm-hmm.
So FERPA protected them on that side as well.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And so, but we also still had teachers that would give them their recommendations. We would have principals that would give them their recommendations. And by that same token, I would have parents that would sometimes ask for recommendations. And by the FERPA rights, I guess it is the teachers, it's the recommender's right to share that if they choose to. I did not.
Yeah, we didn't either.
I didn't. Now, I will tell you, I don't think I ever shared, I don't think I ever wrote anything in a recommendation that I probably wouldn't have felt comfortable sharing, but I never ever shared my recommendations with my students, just because I felt like that wasn't the practice, and I wanted students to kind of get used to what that was like. And I felt like that was part of how I was mentored and what I was taught. So so again, kind of creating that culture in your school, I think is important. But also kind of, it's important to know what your district policies are on, recommendations. Also, what are your district policies on reporting discipline within recommendations on those rating scales? What's your district policies on answering the rating scales? Our district policy, we could not answer the discipline question. We could answer rating scales, but we couldn't answer the discipline question.
And Common App does have a box you can check now. It's against our district policy to report that.
Correct. So we always had to check that box. But we could answer the rating scale questions.
Mhm.
You know, in my purview, you know, I think it's a challenging situation. You know, when do you call? When do you want to check the box and say, I feel like I should call, or, you know, talk to admissions rep? Or when has somebody, you know, been disciplined, and, you know, do they have to pay the price twice? You know, again, I can see both sides of that.
In our climate nowadays, this is what we talked about when our committees were talking about our district policy. What if we have a student who brought a gun to school and was expelled for a year? Do we want that student? Would we ethically feel okay to send that student to a college campus knowing that history? If something happened on that college campus and we didn't give them a heads up on it, were we liable in some way? That's probably a whole different webinar.
Right.
But I think the takeaway is that you talk to your district about discipline, sensitive information, and all that kind of stuff.
Exactly. Yeah. Another question that we get sometimes too is, do you, as the counselor, do you edit and review teacher recommendations? I know some counselors that do. I know some counselors I would not. I had enough stuff to do. But in the program that we used, we could see them and we did them. My approach was always that's on the teacher. And I wanted to train my teachers. I wanted to help them write a good recommendation. I wanted to help them learn so they could represent our students well. And at the same time, if they weren't doing a good job, that was not my job to fix that either.
Right.
You know, but
we saw ours, and my secretary helped me a lot. And she would give me red flags. Hey, can you take a look at this recommendation? And it was either a form letter with lots of mistakes, or they wrote about stuff like it was a bad letter recommendation. And if a teacher can't write a good letter, then say no. You know, even if you have to say, I'm busy and I can't write a letter, if you're uncomfortable telling a student you can't write good things, they need to be able to say no. So then I would not go to the teacher. I would go to the student and say, we need to get you another letter recommendation. But, you know, yeah, I don't want to send stuff out for a student. I think it's our job to protect them a little bit. But yeah, it is kind of a fine line between, you don't want to interfere too much with the teacher recommendation, but you want to protect the student at the same time.
Well, and that's where I ended up getting to, Anne, is just end up guiding students toward other recommenders, you know, or making sure that they're going to be some, if that one is maybe the third recommendation. But
I already got one from so-and-so. Have you thought about another one?
Exactly. Right. Well, they've got two others in there. I think we're good, you know, kind of thing.
And yeah, guiding the student is good on that, Tara. Like when you interview your student, either junior or senior year, and you need to ask them, which teachers are you planning to ask strategic? You know, what are you looking for in your recommendation? Is it academic? Is it leadership? Is it community service? So which teachers are you going to ask? And you know who writes good recommendations. So you might steer them a little bit on who to ask.
Well, and of course, you still want to steer them into sure. I mean, it needs to be balanced. It needs to be teachers from junior, senior year, core teachers who are kind of close to their major or their intended major. I mean, things that make sense,
right?
With where they've been involved. I mean, all of those things, like it needs to be balanced. And so a lot of times that would help me in those decisions too, is, you could steer them in another, well, have you thought about this person? Because you did a really good job, or or remember you're thinking a STEM field, or, something like that, where let's balance this out,
Yeah,
um,
I agree.
so.
Yeah, that's the professional judgment and when to share. That's just a tough thing to look at.
Mhm.
Okay, let's talk about teacher training a little bit. So every year I would have a recommendation workshop at a faculty staff development day. And these are the tips that I would give them. Talk about this. Then the big thing is, don't talk about the kid's whole resume. Don't ask them for a resume. Be able to say no. And as you know,
Mhm.
lines for teachers is huge, and giving them advice on how to manage it. This was our recommendation request form. Again, I made an e-form. You can use if you use a platform like Transeo and Aviance, you can use that. And the student had to fill this out. My students, I made print it, walk to the teacher and ask them in person, can you write me a letter of recommendation? Then the teacher would say, yes, I'd love to, or I've got too many on my plate, or whatever. And the piece of paper served as a physical reminder for the teacher, and they usually kept a folder of them. And also gave them some insight into the student and helped them write it. Academic aspirations and how did this class or activity help you grow? What do you want the teacher to highlight? So again, it's like the counselor recommendation, only on the teacher side. I would almost give it a sample every year. I would mark it to teachers. So I would send them this form, the letterhead for the year with any updates, the PowerPoint presentation, all the hints and tips, and a couple sample recommendations for them to look at. So I did that every year, even though it's pretty much the same teachers writing recommendations. You never know if a teacher used to teach freshmen and got moved up, or it could be new for teachers, some teachers every year, and it doesn't hurt to repeat it for the other people. Again, with your school's policies about FERPA and deadlines, and giving them the permission to say, I can't write you a good one. And Common App and all the other portals get updates every year. So make sure you update it on the technical side as well, and to reach out to counselors for assistance. So I would have teachers bring down their laptop. Okay, I can't get this PDF to work. Or what do I write about this student? It's kind of touchy. So again, counselors are the experts on this. You're the expert. And I want to empower you to be that for your staff as well. Anything to add on that, Tara?
Exactly. No, I love this, because this is a really great reminder for the teacher of what the student, may have been a year or two since that student was in their class. So this is a reminder. And this is also, the student telling the teacher what grabbed them from the class. And so there's a lot to like about these real simple questions, to just jog that teacher's memory, because the teachers are working with a lot of students too. So I think it's just a really great and easy way to help teachers in the process.
Right. Yeah. And it's so easy with technology now, to do a request through your portal or email or Common App. And a student never has to have a tough conversation to a teacher in person. And I would have parents complain about it. Well, he doesn't have time to go find the teacher. Well, then the teacher doesn't have time to write a letter.
Right.
I always say I taught English for 16 years and then I taught life. We're not just getting them into college, we're teaching them life skills as well. So having a conversation with their counselor, going to a teacher and asking them in person, those things are really important life skills.
That's right. Yep.
We have a few minutes for questions. If anyone's on the webinar wants to add a question in a chat, or Tara put the Google Drive for her documents in the chat, you can click on that. Any other things, Tara, that you'd like to add before we sign off?
No, I just like I said, I think my biggest thing with just a large population was the power of these questionnaires. I know it seems like, steps to put students through and additional steps to put students through, but I always told my parents and my students, it really was a game changer for me to be able to write a unique letter for each of my students. So it made a big difference, made a big difference.
Yeah, I'm with you. And I know it's a really tough part of our job as a counselor, just trying to manage all of that. And I wanted to do what was best for my students, not violate FERPA. And, it is just, it's always tricky getting that done and just a big task to do. So
Mhm.
again, I'm going to send this webinar out, the recording out to everybody. If you have questions or you would like more links to some of our samples, you can reach out to me and I'll have Tara and I will share. And we're always willing to share everything.
That's right.
People are always surprised by that, but I don't reinvent the wheel. Take my stuff and use whatever you can. We want to spread the word.
That's right. That's right. And my student questionnaire looks a little different than Anne's. So again, if you want to look at something different, I'd be happy to send mine along, but hers looks great. So it's all, however you want to change it or use whatever you've got, it's really whatever gets you connected to that student. It's what works.
Great. And as always, counselors, thank you for all you do for students.
Absolutely.
And, getting them to college, and we're here to support you any way we can. Thank you very much, everybody.
Thanks for coming.